It's time to huddle up, football fans, and welcome into the Hard Count Podcast, Episode 2. I am your host, as always, Anthony Galler, and thank you very much for joining me today on the Hard Count Podcast. Very excited for this episode. Got a packed show today. It's only been a few days since my first episode, but already so many things have happened in the NFL in these past couple of days. So thank you very much for joining me. As always, this is the NFL Podcast where I discuss one topic for each down in football. So that's 4 downs. That's 4 topics. Let's get it started. And we're going to open up the show today with, of course, one of the most anticipated events of the week in the NFL, and that was, of course, the schedule release. Yes, the NFL schedule release, all 16 games for all 32 teams. And, of course, one of the biggest things when it comes to the NFL schedule release every year is who is going to be squaring off in that season opener. Well, there was a lot of speculation about who that may be. We know it was going to be Kansas City. We know the Kansas City Chiefs, Pat Mahomes, coming off their Super Bowl victory over the San Francisco 49ers. They were going to be playing host to somebody. We just didn't know who that was going to be until now. And it's actually going to be a rematch of the divisional round playoff game from a year ago, as the Houston Texans will travel to Arrowhead to take on the Kansas City Chiefs. Now, of course, I'm sure as most of you remember, that was the game where Houston built up a 24-0 lead early second quarter in Kansas City, in Arrowhead, against Andy Reid, Pat Mahomes, and the Chiefs. And, of course, that was before an onslaught of the Kansas City offense, coupled by an array of mistakes by the Houston Texans on both sides of the ball, really. And what was quickly a 24-0 lead for Houston very quickly turned into what was a 51-31 defeat at the hands of the eventual Super Bowl champions. And of course, the Chiefs putting up an insane 51 points over the span of just 3 quarters. So this is going to be a rematch of that game from the playoffs, week 1 to kick things off for the NFL season. This matchup, it loses a little bit of juice compared to last year's because I think, of course, with the Houston Texans no longer having DeAndre Hopkins, you no longer have that wide receiver matchup of Hopkins for Houston and Tyreek Hill for Kansas City. So the matchup loses a little bit of juice in that regard. Still, don't think it's a terrible matchup. It's certainly not one of my favorite opening night matchups from the past few years in the NFL. But I think the NFL, if I'm going to defend them for a second, I think the NFL did about as good as they could do because actually when you look at the Kansas City Chiefs schedule, it's very interesting to note. Kansas City, basically all of their toughest games this year are actually on the road. When you look at Kansas City, they go at Baltimore this year, at the Buffalo Bills, they go at the Saints, and at Tom Brady and the Buccaneers. So that's 4 games, probably their 4 toughest games on the schedule if you take away the divisional opponents, and all of those games being played on the road away from Arrowhead. So in terms of the home opponents that were left for Kansas City, and again, not counting the divisional games, you had Houston, who, of course, will actually be going down there for week 1. And then you also had Atlanta, Carolina, and I believe the Jets as well. So not a ton of great options for Kansas City in terms of who to host in their season opener. So I think the NFL did about as good as they could do with this one. I think that at the very least, even though this might not be the best of games on paper, at least you're going to get to see that QB matchup of Deshaun Watson versus Pat Mahomes. And we know that Watson and Pat Mahomes, two of the youngest quarterbacks in the NFL right now, 2 of the most exciting quarterbacks in the NFL, without a doubt. 2 guys who came out in the same draft class, very widely publicized draft class, of course, being the same one that the Bears traded up to get Mitch Trubisky in, but that's a different story for a different time. So we'll stick to Watson and Mahomes for now. But no doubt these are 2 of the most exciting quarterbacks in the NFL, 2 playmakers who can do just about anything on the field. We've seen Deshaun Watson going back to his playoff game in the wild card round against the Bills, escaping a sack, which almost no other quarterback could have escaped. We've seen Pat Mahomes with the no-look passes, what he's been able to do. So this is going to be a extremely compelling matchup in terms of the quarterback battle between Mahomes and Watson. So that's very exciting stuff. We get to look forward to that. But it's not necessarily an amazing game on paper. However, I do feel like considering what the NFL had to choose from, when you look at the other options, Carolina, Atlanta, the Jets, I do feel like this was a pretty solid choice for the league to go with. And not only that, but you didn't really want to see a divisional opponent in that first matchup. I don't really like having the divisional opponents going up against each other in the first game of the season. I think that's something the NFL really tries to stay away from because we see those divisional matchups all the time. So it's nice to see a matchup of two really quality AFC teams, although I do think the Texans take a big step back this year without DeAndre Hopkins. But the matchup of Mahomes and Watson is very exciting. I think that Kansas City, just like in that divisional round game last year, I don't see Kansas City having much of an issue scoring against that Houston defense. So I don't know if Kansas City is going to put up 51 again. That would be quite a tall order for them to repeat. But I do think Kansas City will not have many problems scoring against a very lackluster Houston Texans secondary. So I definitely see this being a game where Kansas City could put up 30, 35 points, potentially even more. And it is a game that I very much like the Chiefs to win at home, get their title defense off to a very good start with a 1-0 start against the Houston Texans. And so I'm just very excited for that. I'm very excited for the possibility of football coming back, hopefully. I'm very excited to see from the word go a extremely exciting quarterback duel, I should say, of Deshaun Watson versus Pat Mahomes. I think if nothing else, even if the game is not very close and competitive, I do think having the opportunity to see Deshaun Watson, who's one of my favorite quarterbacks to watch, and Pat Mahomes, who's another one of my favorite quarterbacks to watch, getting the chance to see those two guys go up against each other will be quite exciting. So I'm going to move on to second down now for the show. And one of the other really fascinating things when we have the schedule release every year is the Thanksgiving games. We always know that it's going to be a triple header on Thanksgiving. We know that the Lions and the Cowboys, as the tradition goes, are going to be featured on Thanksgiving Day. And this year we have three very interesting matchups. I actually like these matchups this year. The first matchup, Detroit, of course, will be hosting. That's the early game. And they're going to be hosting the Texans. So we have the Texans yet again here. The Houston Texans traveling to Detroit for this one, take on the Lions. I think this is probably the least compelling of the three games when I look at all of them. You can't really complain about the Lions being there. We know that the Lions are going to be there. Again, with the Cowboys as well. Those two teams host a Thanksgiving game every year, so that's to be expected. But I do at least appreciate the attempt by the NFL to give the Lions a different opponent rather than a divisional opponent, because I don't know if it's just me. Maybe I'm crazy. Maybe I'm wrong. Somebody can tell me if I am. But I really feel like the Lions just play the Bears and the Vikings almost every single season on Thanksgiving. And so I'm at least appreciating a little bit of fresh air with the Houston Texans coming to Detroit rather than the Bears and the Vikings like it always seems to be. At least that's how it feels to me. So again, I do think that'll be interesting in terms of the quarterback matchup. Again, I like Deshaun Watson, one of my favorite QBs to watch, and Matt Stafford. We hope that he's healthy this year. Hope that he comes back strong off the back injury that he really battled and grinded through last year. So hope that he's back stronger than ever. But I think that Matt Stafford, Deshaun Watson will be a fun game to watch, kicking things off on Thanksgiving Day in that early matchup. Then in the evening time, again, you're going to get the Dallas Cowboys as usual in that 4:25, 4:30 slot, whatever it is. They're going to be taking on the Washington Redskins. This is a game I really don't love having the divisional games on Thanksgiving. Again, I just mentioned I really appreciate seeing the Cowboys taking on somebody from outside of the division only because we see those games against the Giants, the Redskins, and the Eagles happen all the time. So I'm a little disappointed in that regard of the fact that they're taking on the Redskins on Thanksgiving. Having said that, I do think that this will be a pretty compelling game, and I don't want people to sleep on Washington. Now, I'm not here to say that Washington's going to win the NFC East, be a playoff team that advances far. I'm not here to say that. But I do think Washington is a lot more compelling team this year, certainly than they were last year. So I do think this matchup against Dallas will actually be a highly competitive game and probably closer than a lot of people may think on paper, because Washington has a legitimate defensive front. And of course, it's bolstered by the addition of Chase Young in the draft this year with the #2 pick. They also get Ron Rivera coming over from Carolina. He's going to be their new head coach. I don't know what Dwayne Haskins is going to be able to do. I don't know if Dwayne Haskins is going to take the next step forward. I think if you're the Washington Redskins, that's certainly what you're banking on, and certainly what you're hoping for is for Haskins to take that next step. I don't know if he's going to be able to do that. That remains to be seen. However, I do believe in this Washington defensive front, and I do believe they're going to be able to get pressure on opposing quarterbacks this season. I do believe they'll be able to generate some pressure on Dak Prescott. So I look at this Redskins at Cowboys matchup, and again, in the 4:30 slot on Thanksgiving, and this is a pretty compelling game to me. I'm excited to see this one. Again, of course, by that point in the season, you hope everybody's healthy. The key guys on both sides are healthy. But yeah, I'm really excited to see this Washington team going up against Dallas in that game. I think it'll be a closer, more competitive matchup than a lot of people might forecast at first glance. But again, I don't love having it be a divisional opponent. I'd rather Dallas be playing somebody else. Last year, even though it was not a good game, Dallas took on the Buffalo Bills last year on Thanksgiving. But this year, they're back to a divisional opponent. They're back to playing the Redskins on Thanksgiving Day. So, I'm a little worn out with that matchup just because I've seen it so many times. And you see Dallas and Philly, you see Dallas and New York so many times. But I do think it should be a very interesting game. And then on the nightcap for Thanksgiving, which is far and away, at least in my opinion, the best game of the slate. And that is going to be a divisional game, although this one I'm a little bit more in favor of because at least it's not, involving the Cowboys or the Lions, who we always see on Thanksgiving. So it is a divisional game, but it's probably one of the most fun divisional games that there is in the sport of football. And that's going to be the Baltimore Ravens traveling to Pittsburgh to take on the Pittsburgh Steelers. This should be a blast of a game. Now, last year, of course, Big Ben did not play very many games. The Pittsburgh Steelers really struggled to score points because they had a revolving door at quarterback of Mason Rudolph and a guy named Duck. So hopefully for the Steelers this season, Big Ben will be back. He plans on being back, and hopefully he'll be as close to 100% as he possibly can be. And then, of course, on Baltimore's side of things, you know what Baltimore is. You know what Lamar Jackson is. You know what this offense is. And they already had a very strong defensive unit last year, one of the stronger defenses in the NFL. Well, they went out and they added Calais Campbell for Jacksonville. They got him for only a 5th-round pick. So a little bit of a highway robbery right there for the Baltimore Ravens. So this Baltimore defense is stacked. The Pittsburgh defense really is stacked too. When you look at Pittsburgh compared to Baltimore last season, the issue when you look at the Steelers and why they barely just missed out on the playoffs, finishing 7th in the AFC, which of course this year would be good enough for a playoff spot with the added spot. But the reason why Pittsburgh really just missed out was because of this offense. They just couldn't score. Again, with Mason Rudolph and Duck Hodges at quarterback, they were just not able to put points on the scoreboard. The defense really kept them in games several times throughout the season. And I do think this Pittsburgh team, again, it's all dependent on Big Ben. It's dependent on guys like James Conner staying healthy, guys like Juju Smith-Schuster staying healthy. But if these guys can stay healthy, this Pittsburgh team is a 10-11 win team in my book. Now, of course, that is all something that we're unsure of right now. We're going to have to see how that plays out. But this Thanksgiving matchup, the nightcap on Thanksgiving Day of the Ravens at the Steelers, has the potential to be just an awesome game. And Baltimore-Pittsburgh games usually are very awesome. They're usually very close, competitive matchups. A lot of these games between those two sides are decided by a field goal or less more times than not. So this has the potential to be a really, really fun matchup, one that I'm looking forward to a lot. So I think when you look at the entirety of the Thanksgiving slate, Texans in Detroit, not great, but could be worse, not terrible. I'd rather see Detroit taking on Houston than a divisional opponent, which I've seen so many times. The Redskins at the Cowboys, would rather it not be the Redskins just because I'd like to see Dallas play an out-of-division opponent. But I am intrigued by the Redskins this year with Ron Rivera and that defensive front. And then, of course, Pittsburgh and Baltimore. That should just be a tremendous game if the two sides are healthy. But in addition to those Thanksgiving games, we actually are going to have this season a very rare game on Christmas Day, on a Friday nonetheless, which is extremely rare, does not happen very much at all. We're going to see a matchup that people should be quite familiar with by now, considering they've played each other in the playoffs the past 3 seasons, and that is the Minnesota Vikings. They're going to be going to New Orleans, and they're going to be playing the Saints. So again, this is a very fun matchup as well. It's going to be on Christmas Day, so it's going to be competing a little bit with the NBA Christmas Day games, which is, of course, the most anticipated day of the NBA regular season every year. But, the NFL, I don't think they're going to have any problems competing. I think this game, it's a matchup that a lot of people like. It's a fun matchup. It's a matchup that we've seen the past 3 years in the playoffs. And I think that the Saints and the Vikings, I don't know if maybe rivalry is the correct word, but I do think just because of the fact that they've met so often, regular season too, but especially just those 3 playoff matchups the past 3 years, these two teams, I don't think these two teams like each other very much right now. And I think that the Saints, excuse me, I was wrong. The Saints and the Vikings have not met the past 3 years in the playoffs. They met 2 of the past 3, but they've played each other quite frequently in the regular season over the past 3 years. And I do think that these teams have a little bit of a budding rivalry in a way. It's certainly not the traditional rivalry. It's certainly not Bears-Packers or Ravens-Steelers. But I think that there is some animosity between these two sides right now. And the Saints, they probably feel like, and I would agree with them, that they were the better side, the better team each of those 2 years that they lost to the Vikings in the playoffs. Of course, last year was kind of, actually both years really in walk-off fashion, but last year with the touchdown, Kirk Cousins to Kyle Rudolph in the back of the end zone, and then going back a few years ago, the very famous Minnesota Miracle that we all know about with Stephon Diggs and Case Keenum at the time. So I think that the Saints especially have a little bit of some built-up animosity towards this Vikings team. So I do think on Christmas Day, that's going to be a very exciting, fun matchup, one that we're very familiar with, but one that I'm not getting sick of. I like seeing these two sides square off. I think these are 2 of the better rosters in the NFC. I think that the Vikings, at the end of the day, they're being held back by Kirk Cousins, but I do think that these are 2 of the most exciting, best rosters in the NFC currently. So I'm very excited for this matchup as well. And so I think that overall, between the Thanksgiving Day games and between this game on Christmas Day, we've got some very exciting holiday matchups in the NFL this season. And so now I'll transition to third down, which is an off-the-field story, but a very compelling story that I absolutely had to talk about. And that is the situation which has transpired with Earl Thomas. Earl Thomas, of course, the free safety for the Baltimore Ravens currently, former Seattle Seahawk. And basically what happened was late Wednesday night, early Thursday morning, TMZ had confirmed a report that Earl Thomas had been found cheating on his wife. And because of this is an incident going back to April 13th. Thomas was found cheating on his wife with another woman and was held at gunpoint by his wife, Nina Thomas. But he was able to somehow, according to the story, wrestle the gun away from her. But having said that, obviously an extremely bizarre, on one hand, extremely bizarre story, certainly not one that we were expecting to hear late Wednesday night and into the early morning on Thursday, but a very scary situation for Earl Thomas as well. And that's not to excuse his cheating. I'm going to say that right now. I'm going to put that out there. I don't want to give any false ideas about what I'm saying. That's not to excuse his cheating, but a very scary situation to be held at gunpoint and nonetheless by your own wife. So this is something that Earl Thomas actually, if you've been listening to what he's been saying, he's been very honest and upfront about. But wild situation, first of all. Again, just a bizarre situation that is not something you're going to hear about in the NFL every day. There's a lot of other a lot of other stories you hear about frequently in the NFL, which are, good and not so good. But this story is certainly one that is a rarity, without a doubt. So Earl Thomas found with another woman by his wife, and then held at gunpoint before being able to somehow wrestle the gun away and avoid further catastrophe, I guess is one way of putting it. Obviously, this is a situation which I think that the Baltimore Ravens are going to look at and look into. I don't know what's going to happen with Earl Thomas. I don't really know. I can't even give a best guess, because when you look at a situation like this that is so strange and so obscure, you kind of have to say, well, are we separating this incident as being something from his personal life, or is this something that would warrant some kind of suspension or some kind of discipline? I don't really know. I tend to err on the side of, I think that this is his personal business. I'm not condoning what he did and his end, his side of things, not condoning the cheating, not condoning his actions in this, but I do tend to err on the side of this is his personal matter, his personal life. I don't know if I want to get, if I'm the Ravens, I don't know if I want to get too much into it. So I don't know how the Ravens are going to handle it. It's certainly a situation I think that they will look into and be wanting more information about. But I'm not exactly sure what to make of this situation. I think that it's possible, and I think that there's a potential that maybe the Baltimore Ravens could hand out some sort of punishment, maybe just because of optic-wise how it looks to some people. I think it's possible. Having said that, again, I err on the side of this is his personal matter, his personal business. It's certainly a very scary situation for him. Now, regardless of what you think about cheating and all of that, again, I don't condone any of that, but a very scary situation for Earl Thomas to find himself in. Now, the only thing I question about this situation, aside from the cheating, I question that wholeheartedly. But the other thing I question about this situation is that this allegedly goes back to April 13th. So that's about a month ago now, a little bit less than a month ago now. But April 13th, at that point in time, because of the COVID-19 situation that we're all dealing with right now, at that point in time, we were all already in quarantine, supposed to be quarantined, not be going out for non-essential things. So I really would like to know more about what exactly Earl Thomas was doing outside with other women who were not his wife. Again, that's a personal matter. Maybe I shouldn't get too much into his personal life, his personal situation, but it does make you wonder. April 13th, less than a month ago, at that point, we were all supposed to be quarantined. So I do wonder a little bit, at least, what exactly Earl Thomas was up to and what exactly he was thinking. Still doesn't take away from the fact that a very scary situation for him. I'm certainly glad that he's okay. I'm glad that nothing else came of it, and that, again, as I mentioned earlier, he was able to avoid further catastrophe in that situation. But it does make you wonder a little bit, what exactly Earl Thomas, especially during these times, what exactly Earl Thomas was thinking, what exactly was going through his head. So I don't know what's going to come of it on his side of things. We'll see what the Ravens end up doing. They can take their time and figure out, looking at all the evidence, looking at all the facts. Again, this is a story that just broke into the public late Wednesday night, early Thursday morning. So the Ravens can sit back, look at all of the information and see what they want to do from there. But it's going to be a very compelling story to keep your eyes on, just to see what comes of it. I don't know if Earl Thomas gets any discipline for it. I don't know if he necessarily deserves it, other than just his personal discipline and his personal family, that side of things, what's going to happen when you look at that side of things. But in terms of just NFL punishment, I don't know if he really deserves anything, but we'll see what the Ravens decide to do, and we'll see what where they decide to take things. And finally, that's going to lead us into fourth down already. Things are flying by. It's going to lead us to fourth down, and we're actually going to talk about, well, Earl Thomas used to be a Seahawk. We're going to talk about a guy who played for the Seahawks last season, although he's a free agent right now, and that is Jadeveon Clowney. A lot of, in fact, most free agents have already signed. Of course, it's been now nearly 2 months since the free agency period opened up in the NFL. But perhaps the biggest star, and I talked about Cam Newton on my last show, but perhaps the biggest star in football, free agent, who's not a quarterback, still on the open market, is Jadeveon Clowney. And Jadeveon Clowney last season for Seattle in his first year as a Seahawk, he tallied only 3 sacks, but he was stout against the run, as he almost always is, and he did manage to force 4 fumbles as well. So it was a really nice season for Clowney, despite the fact that he only had 3 sacks. Jadeveon Clowney, when the free agency period opened up, there were reports that he was looking for more than $20 million per year annually. He certainly has not found that money out on the open market so far. A lot of people have wondered about the potential of a reunion with Seattle. Maybe if it's not on a long-term deal, maybe just a 1-year contract. But the recent reports in the past couple of days have suggested that a return to Seattle for Clowney is unlikely unless Clowney really steps back on his demands. I think that Clowney, since the free agency period opened up, he certainly scaled back a little bit from $20 million, but apparently has not scaled back enough in order to make the Seahawks or another team interested enough in signing him. Now, the Seahawks are a little bit strapped in terms of their cap right now, but nonetheless, there could have been another team to this point. Again, it's been almost 2 months since this free agency period opened up. There could have been another team to this point to take in Jadeveon Clowney. Certainly a game changer on the defensive side of the ball, even though he's not a guy who tallies a ton of sacks, and he's never really been that guy in his career. Going back to his Houston days, where, of course, he spent his entire career up until this last season, going back to his Houston days, his career high in sacks was only 9.5. So he's never been a huge production in terms of the sack department, but he has been really stout against the run. He's still able to generate pressure on opposing quarterbacks, get in their face. And so I think that Jadeveon Clowney, despite the fact that he might not be, a 14, 15, 16 sack type of player, I do think that Jadeveon Clowney is very impactful on the defensive line, and I think he'd be a game changer for almost anybody he goes to. So we'll see in terms of if Jadeveon Clowney, he might be on the market a lot longer here. It just depends, I think, really on how much he wants to scale back his demands. Of course, I think, again, since the free agency period opened up, he's scaled back from the demands of $20 million or more. I'm not exactly sure what he's demanding now, but he may have to scale it back even more. And we'll see if he does that or not. I think in terms of just best fits for Clowney, I think, of course, Seattle, they would love to have him back at the right price. Now, as I mentioned already, Seattle is a little strapped in terms of their cash and what they can do with the cap. So I don't know if Seattle's going to be able to bring Clowney back or not. I think it is a little bit of a long shot, unless, as the reports suggest, unless Clowney is willing to really take a big discount in order to come back to Seattle. But if not, I really think the team that I'm looking at in terms of making a move for Clowney, and a team that I think would make a ton of sense, is the New York Football Giants. I think the Jets too, so both the New York teams would be very compelling, and he would be a great fit for both of them. But when I look at the New York Giants, I think the Giants, look, I'm not a huge Dave Gettleman fan. I think that, he does some things that kind of make me laugh, and that I don't see him as being a great GM in this league compared to some of the other GMs. But I will say, I think the Giants have had a pretty successful offseason. I do. I think that they've had a pretty successful offseason. I like the moves that they made, bringing in James Bradbury from Carolina, the corner, brought in Blake Martinez, the linebacker from Green Bay. I thought that they had an overall really solid draft. I think in terms of, their first pick was Andrew Thomas, and number 4, I think they probably could have traded back and still gotten Andrew Thomas. I think personally I would have gone with Isaiah Simmons in that spot, but I do understand with Daniel Jones being, a guy who's going to be entering his second year, I do understand with Daniel Jones wanting to protect him. So that makes sense. The theory of that makes sense to me, protecting the young QB. But I do think the Giants, they've taken some steps in the right direction this year. Now that division, they're going to have to compete with Washington, who, again, I think is being slept on a little bit this year. I think their offense may struggle, but I really like their defense. The Giants are also going to have to compete with the Philadelphia Eagles and the Dallas Cowboys as well. So the Giants are in a tough division, a tricky division for themselves. But I do feel like they've made strides in the right direction to hopefully compete a little bit better this season. And I think that the piece which would really potentially give them an A offseason, because I think right now they've had a really productive offseason, as I've mentioned, with guys like Bradbury, guys like Blake Martinez. They're bringing back, Evan Ingram. There were some rumors, which I never really bought into a ton, but there were some rumors that Evan Ingram could be on the trading block. That doesn't appear to be the case anymore. He's going to be brought back. So I like some of the pieces that the Giants have in place, but I think that they are lacking a little bit of a game record on the defensive side of the ball, especially on the defensive front. So a guy like Jadeveon Clowney, even though he may not be huge production in terms of sacks, again, only had 3 last year, but he did force 4 fumbles, and he was really good against the run, played the run really well. So I do think Jadeveon Clowney, and again, it's got to be at the right price. It can't be at the $20 million a year price. But if Jadeveon Clowney, let's just say he scales it back to 13, 14, maybe 15 mil a year, I think the Giants should hop all over that. I really do. Because I think in this division, I think you got to be able to put a little bit of pressure on the quarterback. I think you got to be able to get after it on the defensive line. So I think that getting Jadeveon Clowney in blue for Big Blue would be a huge addition for them. And take what I already feel like has been a productive offseason and really put a stamp on it with an A+. So that's going to depend on Clowney to a degree because he's a very talented player. He's a guy who I think a lot of NFL teams are currently interested and currently looking at. There's been heard some noise, heard some rumors over the past day or two that I think the Eagles have picked up interest in Clowney. That would be a huge, scary addition for them because this Eagles team can already get after you on their defensive line. So I think adding Jadeveon Clowney, again, even though he might not be the team leader in sacks, I do think adding a guy like Jadeveon Clowney to that Eagles front would be huge for them, what is already a productive defensive front. But I think the Giants need to make a move in that division. A lot of these teams in that division, again, Washington, Dallas, and Philadelphia, they've been very active this offseason as well. So if Clowney can scale back his demands just a little bit, and you maybe get him into the $13 to $15 million range, I think that would be super attractive for the New York Giants. And I think it's a move that they should pull the trigger on in an effort to compete in the NFC East. But that's going to actually do it for me today on this second episode of the Hard Count Podcast. So thank you again for joining me today. Hope you enjoyed it. I want to remind you to subscribe to my channel for more content. Lots more coming soon in the coming weeks. So thank you again for listening to me on the Hard Count Podcast today. We'll see you from the gridiron. Take it easy, and I'll see you again next time. So long.